It was January 26, 1945, deep winter in the forests of France. Snow blanketed the countryside near Holzweiler, and the battle-weary soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division braced themselves for the latest push from the German army. But what nobody expected was that one-man Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy was about to stop a full-blown German assault almost entirely by himself. The numbers don't lie. 6 tanks, 200...
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
And 50 German infantry, and a mission to overrun American positions. What stood between them and success? A single Texan with a rifle, a radio, and nerves of steel. Audie Murphy wasn't supposed to be a war hero. He grew up dirt poor in rural Texas, the son of sharecroppers. By the time he was a teenager, he was hunting small game not for sport, but to keep his siblings fed. When World War II broke out, he was underweight, underage, and rejected by both the Navy and the Marines. But the Army finally took him, and that was all he needed. From Sicily to Italy, from southern France to Germany, Murphy fought in some of the toughest combat zones in the European theater. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving in chaos. Marksmanship honed in the woods of Texas became lethal precision on the battlefield. By 1945, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a leader, forged in fire. But even with that experience, what happened near Holzweiler was almost unbelievable. Murphy's unit had just been hit hard. The German counterattack came fast, with tanks and elite mountain troops bearing down on their position. The Americans were outgunned and outnumbered. Under direct orders, Murphy told his men to fall back and take cover in the woods. He stayed behind. What he did next shouldn't have been possible. With artillery shells falling and enemy fire closing in, Murphy climbed aboard a burning M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle was already on fire and a normal soldier would have run in the opposite direction. But Murphy jumped onto its .50 caliber machine gun and started laying down fire like a man possessed. He stood exposed, fully visible to the enemy for over an hour. Bullets were flying. The tank could have exploded at any moment. But Murphy didn't just hold the line, he directed artillery fire through a field telephone while simultaneously mowing down wave after wave of German soldiers. He was multitasking under the kind of pressure that most people couldn't even imagine surviving. The German advance stalled. One man had disrupted the momentum of an entire force. And after holding them off long enough for his unit to regroup, Murphy finally retreated. But he didn't go far. He joined his men, organized a counterattack, and drove the Germans back. That was the turning point. That's what turned what should have been a crushing defeat into a tactical win. And here's where it gets even more surreal. German records made no mention of the encounter. It was like the entire stand never happened. Why? Probably because it was too demoralizing to admit. The psychological impact of being stopped cold by one guy with a burning tank and a machine gun. That doesn't make it into the war diary. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the drama of it all, but this wasn't Hollywood. Murphy wasn't acting out a scene. He was acting out of necessity, duty, and something deeper, the will to protect his men at all costs. That level of resolve doesn't come from ego or adrenaline. It comes from conviction. And the craziest part, this wasn't even the start of his story. By that point, Murphy had already earned multiple decorations for bravery. He was wounded, decorated, and seasoned. But Holzweiler was different. It was the day he became a legend. The military recognized that too. For his actions, Murphy received the Medal of Honor, the highest military award in the United States. But even that medal didn't fully capture what happened that day. Because what Murphy did wasn't just about courage. It was about strategy, about leadership, about psychological warfare. When one man disrupts the advance of 250 trained soldiers, it sends a message. Not just to the enemy, but to the world. Willpower still matters. But the story doesn't end with the retreat of the Germans. The real cost of war followed Murphy long after the battlefield went quiet. He came home a national hero. But he also came home with nightmares. Audie Murphy suffered from what we now call PTSD. Back then, the term didn't exist in the public conversation. It was called battle fatigue or shell shock. But Murphy lived it every day. Night terrors, flashbacks, moments of panic. He slept with a loaded gun under his pillow. He didn't hide it. In fact, he became one of the earliest public advocates for mental health support among veterans. At a time when most people wanted to forget the war, Murphy was forcing America to remember the toll it took on the people who fought it. He used his platform to talk about the things nobody else wanted to acknowledge. He spoke openly about trauma, about guilt, about the long shadows war casts on a soldier's mind. He pushed for better care for veterans, better treatment options, and less stigma. And that advocacy mattered. Because Murphy wasn't just some anonymous soldier speaking out. He was Audie Murphy, Medal of Honor recipient, war hero, movie star. His courage gave weight to a conversation that was decades ahead of its time. He became a living symbol not just of battlefield bravery, but of the unseen battles so many soldiers continue to fight long after they come home. And that's the part people often forget. The same man who stood alone against tanks and machine guns couldn't sleep through the night without reliving it. The same man who defied death for over an hour in a burning vehicle couldn't shake the guilt of surviving when so many others didn't. That's not weakness. That's humanity. Audie Murphy's story reminds us that heroism isn't just about bullets and explosions. It's about resilience. It's about staying in the fight even when the battlefield shifts from physical to mental. And that legacy still holds weight. Even in the age of drones, satellites, and advanced weaponry, Murphy's stand remains one of the most powerful reminders that war is still, at its core, a human endeavor. Technology changes. The terrain shifts. But the courage of a single soldier can still change everything. Murphy's actions at Holtz were studied, remembered, and honored because they defy conventional military logic. He didn't just slow the Germans down. He broke them. One man dug in, outnumbered and outgunned, made them turn back. He did what entire units sometimes fail to do. He turned chaos into order, desperation into defiance. And for that, his story isn't just a footnote in military history. It's a benchmark of what the human spirit is capable of. So when we talk about war heroes, about courage, sacrifice, and leadership, we're not talking in abstract terms. We're talking about people like Audie Murphy. People who stood their ground when everything said they should run. People who kept fighting when the fight seemed unwinnable. And people who, even after the battle was over, never stopped standing up for their fellow soldiers, for mental health, for truth. If this story moved you even half as much as it should, drop a comment below. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of what real courage looks like. And don't forget to subscribe, we've got more stories coming that'll blow your mind. Murphy's legacy didn't end with the war, and it definitely didn't fade quietly into history books. When he returned home, he was one of the most decorated American combat soldiers of World War II, but what's wild is how young he still was. He wasn't even 21 yet. Think about that for a second. At an age when most people are just figuring out college majors or getting their first jobs, Audie Murphy had already led men in battle, survived multiple injuries, earned over 30 military awards including the Medal of Honor, and held off a full German assault by himself. And instead of riding off into a quiet retirement, Murphy did something even more unexpected. He went to Hollywood. Not because he wanted fame. Not because he had stars in his eyes. In fact, he was hesitant at first. But there was something powerful about being able to tell his story on a bigger stage. And when he finally did step into the spotlight, it wasn't through some over-glamorized war epic. It was through brutal, unflinching honesty. In 1955, Murphy starred as himself in To Hell and Back, a film adaptation of his own memoir. It became one of the highest-grossing war movies of its time, not because it was flashy, but because it felt real. People weren't watching a generic war hero with a jawline and a rifle. They were watching the Audie Murphy, reliving what actually happened on the battlefield. The tension, the trauma, the terror, it all came through, and audiences responded to that authenticity. But even with Hollywood success, Murphy never leaned into the celebrity lifestyle. He stayed quiet, humble, and as many who knew him would say, haunted. That's the part of his story that sticks with you. For all the medals and movie roles, Murphy was still struggling deeply. PTSD wasn't something you could post about on social media or casually bring up in interviews. But he did something revolutionary for the time. He spoke out. He talked about the nightmares, the panic attacks, the guilt, the hypervigilance that never let him fully relax. He admitted that the war didn't end for him when he came home. It just changed form. And that honesty shattered the invincible hero stereotype. He wasn't just a man who fought bravely, he was a man who suffered bravely. A man who kept pushing forward even when the war followed him into civilian life. That's real courage. That's what made his story resonate beyond medals and battlefield stats. Murphy's willingness to speak about the psychological scars of combat laid the groundwork for how we understand veterans' mental health today. His voice, quiet as it often was, became a catalyst for change. And it forced the country to recognize that patriotism doesn't end with parades and flag waving. It means taking care of the people who risked everything and lived to carry the weight of it. And honestly, that's where his influence may have been the strongest. Because yes, holding off 250 Germans on a flaming tank destroyer is jaw-dropping. But fighting for veterans' rights while battling your own trauma, that's a whole different kind of heroism. Audie Murphy showed America that you could be strong and broken at the same time. That surviving doesn't mean you're unscathed. That speaking out isn't weakness, it's leadership. And over time, people did start to listen. Policies shifted. Resources improved. PTSD went from a taboo subject to a recognized, diagnosable condition, one that deserved treatment, compassion, and awareness. Murphy wasn't a doctor or a politician, but his voice cut through because he lived it. That's the impact of someone who doesn't just survive history but shapes it. And his reach went even further than mental health and military circles. Murphy became a cultural symbol, the quiet warrior who never asked for the spotlight, but held it anyway because the story needed to be told. It's kind of poetic, in a way. He was always reluctant about fame, and yet the sheer gravity of what he'd done kept pulling attention his way. Not because he chased it, but because some stories demand to be heard. And here's what gets overlooked sometimes. His heroism didn't stop in World War II. He continued to serve. He stayed in the Army Reserve. He kept training, kept leading, and remained involved in military affairs long after he had any obligation to. Because for Murphy, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about duty. About living up to the weight of those medals. About honoring the memory of the friends he lost, those who didn't get to come home. That sense of responsibility never left him. And yet, his personal battles never fully quieted either. He struggled financially. He dealt with insomnia and depression. He gambled. He coped however he could. And still, he kept showing up, whether it was for a fellow veteran, a fundraiser, or another long conversation about what war really does to people. He wasn't flawless, but he was relentless. In a way, Audie Murphy became a symbol of America's complicated relationship with war, its glory, its trauma, its aftermath. He was the decorated soldier the country wanted to celebrate, and the broken man it didn't quite know how to support. He made people confront both sides of the story. And it makes you wonder how many other Murphys were out there, suffering silently. How many soldiers never got the chance or the platform to say, "This didn't end for me," when the shooting stopped. Murphy gave those people a voice. Even today, his legacy is still shaping conversations about what heroism really means. Because while the image of him standing alone on that burning tank is iconic, the why behind it matters more. He didn't do it for fame. He didn't do it for medals. He did it because his men were in danger, and someone had to buy them time. And when the smoke cleared, and the Germans fell back, and the silence returned to that forest in France, what he'd done was so unbelievable that even the enemy couldn't bring themselves to record it. That says everything. This wasn't a battle. It was a statement. That one man can change the tide. That leadership isn't about rank or title, it's about what you do when there's no one else left to act. That courage isn't loud. Sometimes, it's deadly quiet, focused, absolute. That's what Audie Murphy embodied. And decades later, that example still echoes. In every soldier who stays behind to cover their unit's retreat. In every veteran who opens up about trauma. In every policymaker who fights for better mental health resources for those who served. It all leads back to that snowy forest. To that single figure holding the line while the world burned around him. Murphy passed away in 1971 in a tragic plane crash. He was only 45 years old. But in his short life, he accomplished more than most could in 10 lifetimes. His grave, fittingly, rests at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most visited sites there. People still come to pay respects. Not just to the war hero, but to the man who kept fighting long after the battlefield was gone. And maybe that's the real lesson in all this. That heroism doesn't end when the mission does. It doesn't stop when the war is over. Sometimes, the hardest battles come later when the crowds are gone and the cameras are off. And showing up anyway. That's what makes someone unforgettable. It's almost hard to wrap your head around it, right? A 5 feet 5 inches farm kid from Texas ends up becoming the living embodiment of valor. And then when the world's cheering quiets down, he uses his voice to spotlight the wounds nobody sees. It never stopped being real for Murphy. Even at awards ceremonies, even on movie sets, even when people stood in awe of his medals, he carried the memories of war like a second skin. It was always there. The noise, the flashbacks, the weight. And he didn't hide it. He didn't sugarcoat it. He talked about it. And in a time when silence was expected, especially from men, especially from soldiers, that alone was revolutionary. Murphy's courage didn't retire with his uniform. It morphed. It evolved. It turned inward, fighting battles that left no visible scars but cut just as deep. His honesty peeled back the curtain on a truth most people didn't want to see. That heroism and trauma are often intertwined. That being strong doesn't mean being unaffected. And that survival, it comes with a cost. Murphy paid that cost every day of his life. And maybe that's what makes his story hit so hard. Because as extraordinary as his actions were, he never tried to make himself larger than life. He was life-sized, vulnerable, flawed, real. And that made his strength even more staggering. He didn't chase the spotlight, but he used it. When the cameras were on, he didn't perform, he educated. When reporters asked about glory, he talked about ghosts. When fans praised his toughness, he reminded them that he cried, that he lost friends, that he came home different. It was a kind of transparency that you just didn't see back then, especially not from war heroes. He told America, "You can honor me without pretending I'm invincible." And somehow, that made him more iconic. Let's be clear, Audie Murphy didn't just become a symbol of military bravery. He became a mirror for a nation trying to reckon with what war really leaves behind. For all the flags and fanfare, he stood there as proof that the emotional aftermath is just as real as the bullets. And it changed people. Veterans heard him and felt less alone. Families started asking different questions. The conversation around PTSD, which had been buried under decades of shame and misunderstanding, began to shift. Slowly, yes, but meaningfully. And even now, his impact lingers. Walk into any modern conversation about veteran mental health, and his name still surfaces not just as a warrior, but as a witness. A person who made space for pain. A person who made it okay to not be okay. He wasn't perfect. And that's the point. His legacy isn't some sanitized, Hollywood-ready version of heroism. It's complex. It's layered. It's deeply human. He saved lives in combat and opened eyes at home. He won medals on the battlefield and fought for dignity afterward. That's rare. And maybe that's why, all these years later, his story still makes people pause. Because it's not just about one moment in a snowy forest with a burning tank and impossible odds. It's about everything that came after. It's about the cost of courage, the responsibility of survival, and the quiet, determined effort to make sure no one else had to fight alone in the dark. Audie Murphy's life wasn't just a war story. It was a truth story. And it's one that still matters. So if you're still here, still listening, still thinking about what it all means, don't let this story end with you. Share it, talk about it, and hit that subscribe button so we can keep diving into the moments that history tried to simplify but never should have. Drop a comment below what part of Murphy's story hit you hardest. Let's keep the conversation going. Because some legacies deserve more than a paragraph in a textbook. They deserve to be remembered in full.